Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to having you in North Dakota to see what we're doing there. I'm disappointed that Governor Hickenlooper had to go. Wanted to commend him on building an energy policy for the state of Colorado that he said is really about developing all of the above, and I commend him for doing that. And so the question that I wanted to put before him, but that I'll start by putting before Ms. Beinecke is, what about a states first approach just like that? In other words, to have transparency at the federal level and to have certain standards that may be set at the federal level, but then beyond that, having a states first approach to regulation on these issues of energy development. From what I heard from Governor Hickenlooper, that's exactly what he was talking about. So would you support a state-led approach to regulation that gives states like Colorado and others the flexibility to truly develop their energy resources?
Senator, I think that, first of all, we do have a states first approach because right now the regulation is at the state level. And what I'm saying is that it's a patchwork quilt really across the 30 states where fracking is going forward. Some states have disclosure, what kind of disclosure requirements they have vary considerably. There are other different rules on setbacks, on well casings. In each state, it's quite different. What we're asking for is that the committee look at what kind of federal standards, minimum standards, should be applied across the country. If the states, and I thought Governor Hickenlooper was very eloquent on this point, that the states are working on this every day. They're trying to figure out what the best standards are. There may be a standard that the states, a number of states have developed, which in effect becomes a federal standard, which would apply then to all states. I think the challenge now is the differentiation and the diversity in the 30 states in which fracking is going on and potentially additional states in the future. So what we're looking at from the environmental point of view is how do you ensure the public that this activity is going on as safely as possible, that they have transparency, they have access to information, that there's ongoing disclosure and monitoring, and that the health impacts where there is growing alarm across the country of what they're being exposed to from water and air pollution, that they have the information on what those chemical and what those emissions are, and that the data is available, and that they are confident that the standards that are being set will protect them.
Would you say hydraulic fracturing is the same everywhere in the United States? Are they pursuing the same energy product? Are they pursuing the same geological zones? So,
well, the geology differs across the country, but the technology...
Excuse me, let me ask my question, please.
I'm sorry.
You're talking about a federal standard and having it the same across the United States, but isn't it true that hydraulic fracturing and what they're doing in different places is different?
Senator, I think that in many of our environmental safeguards, there's recognition that there are conditions that differ in different parts of the country. I mean, our state implementation plans are on air quality are differentiated state by state, but they're based on federal standards. And most of our environmental laws actually do recognize that the conditions in states vary considerably. But it does set a minimum standard that the public can be confident is designed to protect them. And that is a combination of learning from the experience of what's going on in the states, but then looking at what the federal responsibility is and applying that in a way that allows differentiation but meets a certain standard so the public's protected. And I think that, you know, our focus here, and this really is a direct response to what we're hearing from people all over the country. Right now, they don't feel protected because they don't have access to information. The growing health concerns are just beginning to be looked at by EPA, by the National Institute of Environmental Health, by the National Academy of Sciences. I thought Mr. Livers was very eloquent on this point that we're 4 or 5 years into a major boom that could take as much as a century. Let's get it right at the start, and that's really what we're asking for.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask for a little leniency on my 5 minutes, given the length of time it took to get to answer questions and the length of some of the responses, so if you would, please bear with me for just a minute. Mr. Gerard, so in a conversation that Ms. Beinecke and I just had, clearly, whether it's hydraulic fracturing or other energy development, we develop different types of energy in different places, in different ways around the country. That argues for a state-led approach with some federal standard of, you know, basic safety and transparency, which I think captures your answer, which is exactly the kind of legislation that I've tried to put forward. Why isn't that a good approach? What's the concern with that? Why do we run into resistance when we say state-led approach, but we have to recognize there are differences in different parts of the country in how we produce the energy and what we're doing, so you allow flexibility rather than a federal one-size-fits-all standard. Can you address that for me?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors, Senator, and it's a great point. It goes back to Governor Hickenlooper, and I wished he were still here to address it because he's dealt with this in Colorado, where he's been able to harmonize all those different interests. But I think part of the conversation is based, in my view, on a false premise, and that premise is that somehow Washington is the best place to regulate. We shouldn't forget in these states, which are the incubators of ideas with different hydrology and geology, there is no one more highly motivated to protect their water and to protect their air than the people who live in those communities, governed by their state regulatory activities, etc. The phenomenon we see today in the oil and gas business is one of increase in terms of activity. Hydraulic fracturing has been around for 65 years. We've drilled over 1.2 million wells with it. And as Lisa Jackson, administrator of EPA, has said, here in the United States, there's never been a confirmed case of groundwater contamination as a result of hydraulic fracturing. So this myth, in my view, of somehow we've got to rush in and then overlay a potential level of regulation that conflicts with the states who know best about hydrology, water quantity, etc., and the geology they deal with their state geologists, we need to look closely and look at those states and say what's taking place here today. And I'll tell you, the states have moved very quickly. The state of Pennsylvania I mentioned earlier. They've modified their state standards, regulatory, legislative activity 4 times already to keep up with the fast-moving industry. The states have moved quickly. Governor Hickenlooper and others, they're very active. Great blessing there. He's a geologist. He gets it. He's been part of it. And he's been able in a very positive way to bring the different interests together and find the proper role where the states historically have led in regulating oil and natural gas.
Okay, so for each one of you, and I'm wrapping up here, but I'd like each one of you to respond with a state-led approach where you have that ultimate federal backstop, because I think this takes into account both your answers. How do we get people working? We've all agreed we need a comprehensive energy plan for this country. Governor Hickenlooper talked about it for his state of Colorado. I could spend a long time telling you about our state of North Dakota. Senator Murkowski could talk about Alaska. Each one is different, but each state is doing amazing things. We all want a comprehensive national energy policy, jobs, energy, the whole ball of wax, but we've got to give the flexibility and empower the private investment. A state-led approach with this federal transparency and backstop does exactly that. I'm building off both your answers. How do we get consensus built in this committee and this Congress to get this legislation passed, which myself and others are putting forward? How do we bring people together to get the consensus to do that? States first approach, state-led approach with that federal transparency and backstop. And Ms. Beinecke, if you could start, and then just to answer from each of you, again, how do we get it done? We're talking about it, we've been talking about it for years. How do we get it done?
I would emphasize the important federal role here because I think there is differentiation among the states. I thought Governor Hickenlooper really identified what needed to happen is you need all the stakeholders at the table. Now, the way a lot of these standards that have been developed at the states, the public is not at the table. People that have concerns in their local communities, in some places, are not allowed to express those concerns. That's a situation we have in New York State right now. So if you have a process that really does bring all the stakeholders together to ensure that the concerns that the public actually have and are very deeply concerned about are addressed as you work with the industry to look at how this resource is going to be developed, that would be a good process. I think up until this point, a lot of concerned citizens have felt they haven't had a participatory role in the process, and they're looking for one.
Seems to me that's what the whole comment process is all about that states have when they develop their laws and regulation. I think that was what we're trying to do, but I'm trying to reach out and get people working together here. Mr. Gerard?
Senator, I'm just going to read 2 quick sentences, and this is Lisa Jackson, the administrator of the EPA. The vast majority of oil and gas production is regulated at the state level. Then she goes on to say, so it's not to say that there isn't a federal role, but you can't start to talk about a federal role without acknowledging the very strong state role, end quote. My counsel would be, as we look at the issues, let's identify the real issues. Let's talk about the issues that are really in concern. I take strong exception to what Ms. Bennett said here. There's a very active, transparent process taking place in these states, and no place is more evident than the state of New York and what's going on up there in terms of citizens being involved, expressing their views, and the governor's very active and taking all this in. So let's sort through some of our own perceptions, our own wishes of what should happen. Let's look at the issues in light of the historic regulatory role for the states and identify if there's anything there we need to look at. But once again, defer. The states have done this well. Lisa Jackson says they're doing it well. There's no reason for the feds to step in, overlay it, and create conflict.
Okay, Mr. Eisenberg, now you're going to explain in 2 sentences how we bring those groups together and get her done.
That's a very good question. You know, I think the one-size-fits-all approach, I mean, there needs to be some trepidation on the part of the federal government to regulate without understanding the consequences of it. How do we get those two groups together? Good luck. I mean, it's starting.
But it's the key to a national energy policy that works. And Senator Wyden, I think if anybody can do it, I think our chairman's the kind of guy that can build that kind of consensus. So we've got to figure out how to do this.
Yeah, I mean, and we're certainly at the NAM certainly willing to work with the committee toward that sort of goal. I mean, we would like to see more bipartisanship on energy issues. We don't think that energy, and particularly natural gas, should be a partisan issue. And frankly, on this committee, I don't view it as being that. But we certainly are willing to work with you on that.
Well, we'll need your help. Thank you all very much.
I thank the senator from North Dakota, and I don't want to make this a bouquet tossing contest, but I think the senator from North Dakota has really put his finger on it, because if you listen to how you described it, Senator, you talked about federal transparency. You talked about a federal backstop. And of course, a very strong role for the states, recognizing that there are differences. And when you look at the architecture of the environmental laws in particular, you see what the senator from North Dakota described all over the place. Essentially, these federal minimum standards, and then a wide berth for the states to kind of go do their thing. I was telling Senator Murkowski, so I came to the United States Senate in 1996, first new senator from Oregon in 30 years, had a full head of hair and rugged good looks and all that. And the first thing I voted for, which dismayed some of my supporters, was the Kempthorne Amendment, which in effect had what you all are talking about, a strong kind of transparency and backstop role, but then the states could go off and do their own thing. So